So what is this thing called formal analysis? Make sure you have your art history worksheet at the ready, because I'm about to explain some definitions. And completing this worksheet will help you throughout the semester to analyze and really dig into what's going on visually. And that's going to be our foundation for then interpreting what's going on more historically, contextually, hence the two sides of the worksheet. One way of thinking about formal analysis is we're measuring, right? We're determining how the colors are working, how the lines are working in a given piece of art. And we'll start with some very basic words, form and composition. But for art history, they mean very specific things. Form refers to an object's structure. Shapes that you see in the artwork, or simply like you see here in Botticelli's Venus, bodies, human forms, figures. That's what we want to analyze. So what type of form? Have some adjectives at the ready. When it's a human figure, is it muscular? Is it slender? Are they large? Are they small? You're describing the body, describing the form. Now with more abstract work, then we're really actually talking about shapes, triangles, squares, circles. But with more organic shapes like people and animals and trees, we can still talk about them in terms of basic geometry. How round, how curvy, how circular, how triangular. Because as we'll find, Renaissance artists love to incorporate geometry even into paintings of organic, non-geometric forms. And those forms are arranged on, in this case, a canvas by composition. It literally means to compose the work. How did Botticelli, the painter, organize the people, the figures on his canvas? And so for this, we need more directional terminology. Is somebody centered, like Venus is in the center? Is there a balance of figures on both sides? And where's our eye going? Do we stay in the center? Does our eye move from side to side horizontally? Are we, changing focus vertically, perhaps looking up and down? All of that is what the artist has thought about in terms of composition. Again, very basic, material and technique. These probably aren't new words, but again, they mean specific things for art history. Another term for these is the medium of the work. And you'll see that on the slide list. That's part of identifying the piece, what's it made of. And you'll also see the word medium in the textbook. So don't get confused when the author might switch back and forth between material or technique and medium. Material should be pretty cut and dry, right? Is it paint? Is it bronze? Is it marble? Is it wood? That is the physical thing, the physical material that the object is made of. Technique for us is very specific. Technique refers to the physical process of altering the material. So, Jan van Eyck's technique here is painting, and his material is oil paint. On the right-hand side, Donatello's technique is casting. Molten bronze is his material. So the technique really depends on the material chosen. You're not going to be painting in molten bronze, most likely, and you're also not going to be casting with molten oil paint. So brush strokes and glazes, those are all specific parts of the painting technique at use here. Hollow cast molds, lost wax technique, all of that is specific to the creation of a bronze sculpture on the right. Line and color You think you know everything about them? We're not here to identify and point out that there are lines. We're not here to say, well, this includes blue. Again, that's very basic. That's a description. We want to get further into it with analysis by looking at how the lines define shapes, create shadow, portray textures, and we want to analyze how the color varies in hue, that's blue, red, or orange, value, darks and lights, or tones, dull to bold and bright. So again, not just that they are there, but what are they doing? Is it a bold, bright blue? Or, like on the right-hand side, one of chapter 20's works, is it simply black ink, leaving some color to the imagination? But even when there isn't any colored ink on a print, we can see value, darks and lights. We can see the textures of feathers and scales and fur and the clothing being torn on poor St. Anthony there. So in essence, Martin Schongauer there is using line not only to define the shape of the saint, but to portray the textures of the saint's body and his hair and his clothes and the demons that are attacking him. In print, in black and white, line is the major conveyor of meaning. In a painting, especially a miniature, like October on the left here, color and line work together to convey the meaning. Now a note about texture. The basic definition is the quality of the surface. Texture could be rough or smooth, dull or shiny. And especially with sculpture, it might be tempting to talk about the tactile texture. What would it feel like if we could touch it? But remember, not only are we looking at things online, on video, in photographs, but even if we could go visit the museum or go visit the church where this is, we wouldn't be able to touch it. So the texture we're interested in, and the only texture I'll ask you about, is the represented texture. So not the texture of the bronze, but the texture of what Ghiberti has portrayed in bronze. The texture of the rocky ground, the swirling drapery of Abraham, the smooth skin of Isaac. All of those are represented textures in a way that Ghiberti is making bronze look like cloth, look like hair, look like skin. He's transforming the material. So we want to think about the illusion of texture and not the realism of texture if we could physically touch it. Okay? Again, we can think about literal space, the 3D space around a sculpture, for instance. But the really good part of analysis is to look at the illusionistic represented space, like the illusion of depth in a two-dimensional painting here, the illusion of real physical three-dimensional bodies sitting, standing, occupying that represented space. So as a formal analysis term, it might seem a little simplistic, but it means a lot. How is the artist creating the illusion of space, of depth? And for many of our other artists, are they even concerned with it at all? One of the main techniques, one of the main ways an artist can create the illusion of 3D space on a 2D surface like a painting, or in this case, a relief, is perspective. Two types of perspective to learn: linear, which is where an artist uses converging diagonal lines on a horizontal line at a vanishing point, and atmospheric, where an artist uses fading colors to give the illusion of distance, so far away that our eyes can't even make out the lines of trees on the horizon anymore. Now, some cultures, like the Japanese, have not paid much attention to linear perspective as the Italian Renaissance artist Ghiberti has. So depth here is mainly described by the swirling lines of the river and the texture of the trees. We believe a sense of three-dimensionality through color and line, but it's not particularly linear or atmospheric perspective. So our viewpoint here, as if we're kind of floating above the river perhaps, is not quite as concrete as the viewpoint created by linear perspective. When an artist uses the converging lines at the vanishing point of a horizon, we get a sort of tunnel-like view, a very mathematical, very exact sense of depth, as if we are standing at the beginning of a giant cube. And that's only enhanced in Ghiberti's work with the very square, angular architecture that he's framed the story with. And to fill that space with realistic looking bodies, one might use foreshortening. That is representing a body at an angle to the picture plane. So not purely frontal, not purely profile, in which the body could appear to contract or shorten. One very extreme example is Mantegna's foreshortened Christ. An example of a lack of foreshortening would be the Egyptians' design of T watching a hippopotamus hunt in a limestone relief. In a very strict profile and frontal view, there's not going to be any need for foreshortening. We still get a sense of depth by overlapping, layering, and scale or size. But see, that doesn't really give us a point of view, a perspective, right? When we foreshorten something, it puts us in relation to that object. And if you're not familiar, the picture plane is simply kind of that imagined vertical screen between us and the space of the painting. So you can think of it as the literal screen of your computer. You could think of it as the flat surface of the painting itself. And when something appears to pop out of the picture plane or recede back in, that's when an artist is using foreshortening. And that can have an effect on proportion. It can have an effect on how the human body looks, and it can affect just how much we believe that it is a real three-dimensional human body. In fact, in some artworks in this course, you're going to see rather unrealistic portrayals of proportion and scale. Proportion is the relationship of sizes. If you're familiar with mathematical proportions or ratios, you already have the right idea. So for us, scale means size. The size of a king relative to his attendants, here in a Nigerian example. Also, the relationship of the king's head to the rest of his body. Now, if we just look at the man in the center, the ruler, does his head look a little too big for his shoulders? Maybe. Now look at the relationship of king to his ride, his steed. Poor guy looks a little too small to carry that man, doesn't he? On top of that, our attendants steadily decrease in size, which we could interpret as adults versus children, surely. But then what about the two that seem to be floating up in the air? One big clue with something like hierarchy of scale or an intentional distortion of size, that's when we need to really think about interpretation. All of these formal analysis terms lead us to an interpretation, first and foremost of the artist's choices. So in this course, there aren't very many bad words. Two of the worst are right and wrong. You might look at this and say, well, they did it wrong. They didn't display the human body correctly. Well, there's an intentional choice to make the king look bigger than his attendants, than his horse, than the space around him, to portray his importance, his rulership. On top of that, it is an intentional choice to make his head appear bigger in proportion to his body. Because in cultures like the Yoruba of modern-day Nigeria and other countries in Western Africa, the head, the face, is really the seat of spiritual presence, personality, and in the case of a king, divine lineage. So of course the head's going to be bigger. It has a bigger descriptive role to play. So as we move forward, we're thinking about everything we see on the screen, on the picture plane, as intentional, right? Not a mistake, not right or wrong, but thinking about what choices did the artist make? What are we meant to interpret from that? Now, all this might not seem to apply to buildings, but it does. Scale, of course, applies to buildings. How tall is it? How wide? How long is the nave of a church, for example? And we determine these things not only through photography that I showed you in the intro, but in two basic architectural drawings, a plan and a section. So we have a plan on the left, which is essentially a diagram of the building as if we were looking at it from above and we had sliced through, almost like a cake, the vertical structure of the church. So everything that is dark black on a plan, those are vertical supports. That is the little bones of the building, or the feet, if you will. Everything that appears in a line or a dotted line, those are kind of the interconnecting horizontal structures that go from vertical support to vertical support. Okay? And where we see gaps, those are windows, doors. We have the notation here of, oops, get my pen ready here. Stairs and other rooms. And very handy, we have scales on each architectural drawing that'll show up. In fact, you should have a scale on every photo in your book. So if you're not familiar with how to use a scale, let me know and we can give you a much more realistic sense of just how big the dimensions of paintings and sculptures and churches are. In section, it's the opposite of plan. This is as if we are looking, standing on the ground, looking into the nave of the cathedral, but we've sliced vertically. So we've essentially taken the front off the building. So there we can again see the vertical structure, but also we get to see a bit more about the materials used. So we have some detail of the masonry here, as well as the arches it used in a standard Gothic cathedral. And all of those things I just said, those relate to form and composition, right? The form here is a pointed arch. Composition is horizontal, vertical, depending on the plan or section that you're looking at. And one great way of thinking about composition in terms of a building is, how do you move through it? So everything on your formal analysis worksheets can be applied to a building. All you have to do is think about it in very basic terms: shapes, directions, horizontal, vertical, and think about the line of the building, the colors of the building, especially when we use a photograph. That includes the stained glass windows. What kind of light? We're talking color there. Materials and techniques, of course, are at use. Stone masonry, stained glass. Proportion and scale. Definitely we have a sense of superhuman scale interior. We're dwarfed by the scale of this church. The one thing that isn't really applicable to an architectural drawing or building, perspective and foreshortening, right? So not every formal analysis term will be relevant depending on what you're looking at. If we have a three-dimensional sculpture, foreshortening is not at play. If we have the interior of a cathedral, perspective's not at play here because you're looking at a real building, not the depiction of one on an oil painting. That's where perspective is used. That's where foreshortening is used. So remember, if it's 2D, perspective and foreshortening are applicable. If it's 3D, like architecture or sculpture, you can just skip right over those terms. So as you read, keep the worksheet handy. You know, print it out if you can, or have it maybe on your phone and the book open on your computer, if you're able to do so. And approach the material in two ways. You're learning the vocabulary, you're learning how to deal with visual information as well as textual information, but also be asking yourself these questions. Why did the artist make that choice? And that's what the author will answer in each paragraph about each artwork.